arriving at a robust project schedule can be difficult. But in this video, I'm going to break it down into a simple process of 3 phases with a total of 10 steps. The 3 phases that we're going to look at are understanding, estimating, and consolidating. Let's start with phase 1. Understanding. Step 1 is to understand the context of your project. This will give you a sense of the political dimension of your project, but also the external dependencies, all the things that are going on around your project that can have impact on what you're doing. They can either be dependencies that dictate when you do things and how you do things, or the constraints which limit your choices. Step 2 is to understand the history that is relevant to your project. Look for reference projects and parametric data that you can use for making your estimates. Parametric estimating can be one of the most robust approaches that you could take, as long as the reference projects that you use are truly comparable to the project that you're going to be doing. So, it's not only important to understand the similarities, it's also critical that you understand any systematic differences between your reference projects and your current project. Step 3 is to understand the requirements. Do your research on what it is that your stakeholders need, and also what they want, what their priorities are, and what their preferences are. Also, look at the possible impact of differing priorities amongst your stakeholders. These can cause conflict that can lead to changes in the specification down the line. This is therefore a source of risk and needs to figure in your estimates, particularly in the contingencies that you allocate. Fourth, document your assumptions. All estimates are rooted in a set of assumptions. We need to make assumptions, but if we forget that that is all they are and we fail to document them, then we may not test those assumptions. If they turn out to be correct, then we can have more confidence about our estimates. If they turn out to be wrong, we can change those estimates. So, first, articulate and document all of your assumptions. Second, test each of them for validity, or at the very least, plausibility. In the latter case, check the impact of applying alternative plausible assumptions. And if you need to, change the assumptions on which you're going to base your estimating. Phase 2, estimating. Step 5 is to make an initial top-level estimate. Start with an initial high-level estimate. For this, you can use order of magnitude estimating, top-down estimating, parametric estimating, or simply expert judgment. Agile estimating techniques work well here too. Story pointing, t-shirt or bucket sizes, or even planning poker. What matters here is bringing to bear your experience and choosing a simple process that will give you a rough idea of the scale of the schedule that you're going to need. Step 6 is to make a detailed estimate. The most structured approach to this is to break your project down into parts and to use a work breakdown structure and to apply your estimates bottom up to the items on your work breakdown structure. Here is where you might start to apply more sophisticated estimating processes like 3-point estimates or a Monte Carlo method, if the project merits that level of work. We have videos on the PERT method and on Monte Carlo method if you need them, and I'll put links in the description below. Step 7 is to express a confidence level for your estimates. Add confidence levels to your estimates so that people can see how certain you are about the scale of your estimates. After all, an estimate only really has value if we know how confident we can be in that estimate. Confidence is the inverse of uncertainty. Experience, data, rigor, checking and review will all decrease the level of uncertainty and therefore increase the confidence in your estimates. On the other hand, novelty, ambiguity, volatility and complexity will all reduce the confidence that you can have in your estimates. We often express uncertainty or confidence as a range. A time estimate of 12 days plus or minus 2 days is an example of a symmetric estimate. A schedule estimate of 30th of September plus 20 days or minus 10 days is an example of an asymmetric estimate. Phase 3, protecting. Your confidence levels will inform step 8, contingency. Add extra time to your estimates based on how confident you are in those estimates. For example, how familiar or novel is what you're doing? How complex is it? And what's the level of risk? The greater the uncertainty, the more contingency you need to add to a given estimate. Step 9 is what if. Identify some alternative scenarios and then analyze those scenarios to see how they would affect your estimates, your confidence levels, and your contingencies. Select a small range of very different plausible scenarios, including some that your team might view as extremely unlikely, and use these to further inform the level of contingency that you add to your estimates. And finally, step 10 is checking and reviewing. Always check your arithmetic. Do the simplest possible estimate using the same basic assumptions on the back of an envelope to give your estimates a sense check. For a more robust approach, you may want to carry out a red team review. Find an alternative team of people who have had no involvement whatsoever in developing the estimates, but who understand the project as well. Ask them to go through your estimating process, your assumptions, your contingencies, your confidence levels with a fine-tooth comb in an attempt to find where you've made mistakes. If the red team fail to find any significant problem, then there's a good chance your estimates are more robust. On the other hand, if they find problems, you can deal with them. An alternative approach to that is to have a shadow estimating team do the whole thing on their own separately and to compare the results. Once again, if the results are broadly similar, you can have a higher level of confidence in your estimates. On the other hand, if the two teams get very different results, then you need to understand what it is about their assumptions or their approach or their methodology that has driven these different results. If you fail to review and test your estimates at this stage, then you'll lose your chance to put your project schedule right before you embark on a possibly flawed project plan. In this video, I'll take you through 5 stages and 21 steps for creating a project schedule. Stage 1 is about the schedule framework. You need to start by getting all of the time and date-related data assembled and ready to use. Step 1, start with fixed milestones. Things like the start date and release or delivery dates. Step 2, add in discretionary milestones. Things like reporting deadlines and release targets. Step 3, add in calendar constraints. Things like public holidays and company days. Step 4, add your resource constraints. Things like staff holidays or the delivery schedules for assets or materials that you'll need for your project. Step 5, consider the number of working hours for each day, and this may be different for different days. Some organisations have shorter working days for the last working day of the week. And remember, if you've got non-working days in the week, as hopefully we all have, then you need to allocate 0 hours to those days. Critically, don't forget that the non-working days may be different in different regions and locations. Stage 2 is the task framework. Here we introduce what we need to do and what we need to do it. Step 6 is to identify the tasks that need to be completed as part of your schedule. These will be in your work breakdown structure, and I'll link in the description to our video on how to create a work breakdown structure. Step 7 is to estimate the work required to complete each task and to do so with the contingency for each task. Step 8 is to identify the dependencies between the tasks. Usually these will be finish to start dependencies, but there are other types of dependencies, and again I'll link to a video which explains all of that. Once you have the dependencies, it will allow you to sequence your tasks. Next, in step 9, add in any lags or leads. A lag is a gap between two tasks that are dependent one on the other. For example, task B might start 3 days after task A is complete, allowing, for example, concrete or paint to dry thoroughly before starting task B. A lead is a negative lag. For example, if task B needs to start 2 days before task A is completed, then this is a finish to start dependency with a 2-day lead. Step 10. Identify the resources you need for each task and find out their availability. And once you've done that, allocate the resources to the tasks. Step 11 is to calculate the durations for each task. This calculation uses the work required and the resource assigned. For example, a task that has a work required of 15 days and 2 full-time staff allocated to it will have a duration of 7.5 days. However, if 3 people are allocated to the same task, but for half of their time only, this will lead to a duration of 10 days. Stage 3 is analysis. This is where you turn your data into a plan. At step 12, you can calculate your critical path, or critical paths, and again, I'll link to a handy video. Step 13 is to consider whether you have the right amount of float. Too much float means you're going to take longer than you need to take, but too little float exposes you to too much risk. There's a judgment to be made here. Step 14. Review your emerging schedule for business sense. Does this produce a consistent schedule that can deliver when you need to with enough contingency? And are your workloads balanced so that none of your resources are overstretched or indeed overstressed? In step 15, you'll almost inevitably need to revise your draft. Consider your contingency and how much resource you have and how to apply them. Do you need to overlap tasks? Apply additional resources to work in parallel or to get tasks done more quickly? Or do you need to reduce the quality or adjust the scope of what you're doing to complete the project in time? Stage 4 is review, and this is where you expose your draft schedule to a critical review. Step 16 is to expose your draft to a critical review from your team. They should be looking for risks and errors arising from things like fundamental errors in your project strategy, data entry mistakes, incorrect data, calculational errors, false or risky assumptions, missing constraints or missing dependencies, poor reasoning, and of course, risks to the project. Step 17. If this is a critical project, then you may want to expose this to further external review. This could be an independent red team, charged with looking for the same kinds of mistakes, but because they're outside of the team, and they're likely to be even more brutal in their scrutiny. And that's a good thing. Stage 5, sign off. Once you have all of the comments from your reviewers, you are ready. Step 18 is to create your final draft. This is likely to take the form of a Gantt chart, so do take a look at our companion video on how to create a Gantt chart. Step 19 is to submit your final schedule for sign-off by either your project sponsor, your client, your project board, or your steering group. Step 20 is to up-issue your final draft with comments and changes accommodated to version 1. And step 21 is to place your schedule under version control. And yes, we have a video on that too. In this video, I want to answer the question, what is Float? Or, if you prefer, what is Slack, not the software? Float is schedule flexibility. It's the amount of time a project activity can slip without having an adverse effect on another scheduled activity. Float and Slack are two different names for the same thing. Or nearly. Some people reserve the term float for the amount of time an activity can overrun before it has adverse implications. They use Slack to refer to the amount of time that you can delay the start of an activity without having adverse implications. However, these two things amount to exactly the same thing. So it's no wonder that most of us use the terms Slack and float completely interchangeably. Free float is the term we use for the amount of time that a scheduled activity can slip before it has an adverse effect on a successor activity. As a result, free float is also sometimes known as activity float or task float. We calculate free float by taking the earliest start time for the successor activity and subtracting the earliest finish time for the prime activity. Total float is the amount of time that a scheduled activity can be delayed without affecting the finish time of the whole project. Some people therefore refer to it as project float, but as we'll see, that term also has another meaning. We calculate total float as the latest finish minus the earliest finish for an activity, or as the latest start minus the earliest start for the activity. Although some people refer to total float as project float, the term project float has another meaning. Some people use the term project float to denote the amount of time a project can be delayed without affecting the customer, the user, or the stakeholders who are reliant on the project. There's also such a thing as negative float. If your project will be delayed, this is the time between when you can finish a task and when you need it to be finished to assure completion on schedule. The idea of float arose from the development of the critical path method. The critical path is the longest path through a project network. We have videos on the critical path method and its close relative, the PERT method. All activities on the critical path should have zero float unless you decide to schedule in float as a deliberate mechanism to mitigate the risks of delay. So to end, why do we care about float? Why is it an important project management concept? Well, there are 4 primary reasons, and the first is about risk. Where you have less float, you have more risk of schedule delay. As a result, we sometimes choose to build in float as a mechanism to mitigate risk. It's also about prioritization. You need to allocate your resources and your management attention to the tasks and activities where there is least float. The critical path activities which have 0 float are the highest risk activities, and therefore you need to prioritize them by providing the best resources, the most resources, and the most management attention. As a result, float is also about monitoring and project evaluation. You need to keep a close eye on low float activities. And finally, float is about team morale. If all of your project activities have 0 or very low float, it creates a huge pressure of multiple deadlines on your project team. By introducing float, you can ease some of that pressure and therefore raise morale. It creates more time for creative thinking and innovation. And it also gives people a chance to relax and recharge their batteries so that they can come to work ready and enthusiastic for more work. In a constant 0 float environment, people are rushing from one deadline to another without any time to think, without any time to recover their energy and their mental awareness. So, float or slack is an important project management concept. But for those people who think of it as highly technical because of its association with the critical path method, don't worry. The idea is simple, but it is one that's worth understanding. 2 common terms in many projects, particularly traditional predictive projects, are workstream and workstream leader. So, what are they? None of the big manuals of project management include, let alone explain, workstreams. And by big manuals, I mean things like the Project Management Institute's Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, the PMBOK Guide, not the current 7th edition, nor the more expansive 6th edition that preceded it. I also include the APM's Body of Knowledge. The current 7th edition does not mention workstreams, nor does the current edition of the Prince 2 manual, Managing Successful Projects with Prince 2. And finally, there's my trusty project management textbook, Project Management, A Managerial Approach, by Meredith and Mantell. So, are workstreams a real thing? Well, yes they are. And there are 2 ways to think about them. First, on a Gantt chart, we can literally see streams of activities, the long diagonal streams of dependent series of activities. And we will have several of these streams parallel to one another, each of them a work stream. And what about the people who lead these streams of work? Well, you guessed it. Those are the work stream leaders. The other way to think about work streams is with reference to a work breakdown structure, or WBS. At the top level of our work breakdown structure, we break the work down into big areas of work. And these areas of work are our work streams. A work stream in this sense can be constructed either based on geography or region. It can be based on function, or the technology that's in use, or the type of work that's going on. Each of these top-level work streams is headed by someone who understands the type of work that's being done, the workstream leader. So, I shall have to turn to my own guide for a definition of workstream. In be on the inside, decode the jargon of project management, I define a work stream as a subset of the work breakdown structure that is allocated to a single manager, the work stream leader. By the way, if you're looking for a basic project management book that does mention work streams, you could do a lot worse than my introductory book, How to Manage a Great Project. Or, better still, why not take one of my core project management courses? In this video, I want to answer the question, what is a baseline? A baseline is the final approved version of a project plan, and its schedule, its budget, and its scope are then known as baselines. Baseline budget, baseline schedule, and baseline scope. These are the versions against which you will measure all progress and deviations against your project plan. Of the many formal definitions that you'll find for baseline, there are two that I particularly like. Those of the 7th edition of the Project Management Body of Knowledge and Prince 2. The 7th edition of the PMI's Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge describes a baseline as the approved version of a work product used as a basis for comparison to actual results. In the 2017 edition of the Prince 2 guide, we find the definition of a baseline as the reference against which an entity is monitored and controlled. A baseline is created at the start of a project or at the start of a stage of a project. And once we have it, we can use it as the basis for monitoring and controlling our project. However, if there is a significant disruption in the project, such that the baseline is now no longer an appropriate basis for that monitor and control, we may take the time to re-baseline. That is, to step back and create a new baseline for either the project or the stage in the project. The most common form of rebaselining is reactive rebaselining. That is, we recreate a new baseline in response to unexpected events. The alternative is proactive baselining. In this case, we know that at a certain point in the project, there will be something that will happen where we can't predict the outcome. If the outcome can significantly change the decisions we're going to need to make or the approach we're going to need to take, then it makes sense to plan for a rebaselining activity after the outcome of that uncertain event. Once we have some certainty, we can then rebaseline with confidence. Baselining is implemented in the more sophisticated project management software. In this software, we find that baseline data is stored and therefore can be used for comparison with actual data. At any point in the project, we can compare our updated version of the plan against the baseline. That way we can continually replan to handle minor contingencies and yet maintain the baseline and know how far our planning is drifting from our original baseline plan. And once again, I'd like to emphasize that this can apply not only to the schedule, for which it is most often used, but also to the budget and indeed the scope, because scope will change through even the most traditional predictive of projects through the process of change control. For those who are interested in linguistics, then baseline is most commonly used as a noun, a baseline, but we also use it as a verb, to baseline our project. Most commonly, we baseline scope, schedule, and budget. The initial scope baseline is usually expressed through a work breakdown structure or a work breakdown structure dictionary. Our baseline schedule is reflected in a program of work activities over time, and our baseline budget is an initial statement of costs for our project. Our baseline budget usually includes contingency, but it tends to exclude management reserves, which are outside of the direct control of the project team. If the level of costs rises too far above the baseline, probably if it's starting to exceed the contingency, then the project team needs to reconsider the project business case and investment appraisal. However, less commonly, we can also baseline other aspects of our project. A performance measurement baseline integrates the three main aspects of schedule, budget, and scope, and is therefore used for measuring performance of your project, often using earned value management as the prime methodology. A risk baseline establishes the level of risk of the project right at the outset. As the project progresses, you would hope and expect that the level of risk will diminish. However, if unexpected events cause the level of risk to rise above the baseline, once again, we need to reevaluate the project's business case or investment appraisal. If, as you should be, you're also actively managing your benefits, then you may establish a benefits baseline at the outset too. This is usually documented in a signed-off benefits case, which sets out the benefits we anticipate from the project. Once again, if changes cause the expected level of benefits to dip below the baseline, we need to reassess the business case. It's also worth noting that the benefits case is not completely independent of the budget and indeed the risk assessment. Therefore, we might also consider creating a value baseline by combining benefits with costs and risk. This is not a trivial activity, and therefore, for most projects, you'll tend to keep them separate. The final kind of baseline that is used with any degree of frequency is a product baseline. This sets out the initial specification and design of the product or product set that the project is creating. And of course, as the design changes or the specifications change through a process of change control, we track changes to the product or products through configuration management. If these changes have an impact on the level of benefit that the product or products can create, then once again, we need to re-examine the business case if the level of benefits dips below baseline. So, a baseline in project management is very much the same as a baseline in common usage. It is a foundational measure of something important against which we can monitor our performance and therefore make decisions to implement changes when we need to. A lot of project managers use the terms fast tracking and crashing the schedule interchangeably, which is fine, except strictly they are different things. So let's explain. Most of us casually refer to either crashing or fast tracking. Whichever we use, all we mean is moving a project more quickly. The fancy terms for that are expediting the project or schedule compression. And there are two ways that we can expedite a project or compress the schedule. And if you want to be technically correct, one of those is crashing and the other is fast tracking. But you know what? I've used both terms to mean both things in the past. So this is technical knowledge. It doesn't matter that much in the real world. But my favourite project management textbook, Meredith and Mantell, is clear. Crashing a project or crashing a timeline is the use of additional resources to get the project done more quickly. We can do this with extra staff, specialised equipment, the use of overtime, or buying ready-made components, sometimes referred to as COTS, commercial off-the-shelf components. Fast tracking is the process of doing work in parallel that you would normally do sequentially. That is, starting a new workstream while the other is still ongoing. By doing two things at the same time, you can get through work faster, as long as you have the resources to do so, which of course might mean bringing in additional resources, so we're fast tracking and crashing at the same time. See the point? The other thing that can stop you from fast tracking is the presence of dependencies or constraints, which mean that you can't do things in parallel. You have to finish one before you start the next. An example of fast tracking comes from the construction sector, where you would normally finish doing a design before you start doing the construction work. But if we were to start the early phases of construction while the final touches to the design are being put together, then in principle we can get the project done more quickly and finishing earlier. However, we can easily see what some of the risks might be. So, in summary, there are two main ways that we can expedite our project or compress the schedule, and both of them have risks and costs. Crashing uses additional resources or makes greater use of the resources we have. It therefore trades schedule advantage for additional cost and the possibility of burning out our resources. Fast tracking makes use of parallel activities. And so, by doing things at the same time rather than one after another, we can finish earlier. In this way, we trade schedule advantage for additional risks around dependencies, interfaces, and the lack of knowledge of how each thread of activity is going to finish before we start the next. Getting things done early always comes with a cost, but that cost may be acceptable. And the three ways that you can do it are through fast tracking, through crashing, or more likely, through some combination of them both. Milestones are the most basic project planning and project tracking tool. So in this video, I'll answer the question, what is a milestone and what is milestone tracking or milestone monitoring? Milestones are moments in time. We use them to mark significant points in our project. Things like completion of an important task or a series of tasks, or delivery of a product, or a decision being made. But we also use milestones to mark less significant events, the completion of stages in big tasks or series of tasks. If I have a 3-week piece of work and I allocate it to Peter, I can agree with Peter that 3 weeks is about right. So being a good manager, towards the end of the first week, I ask Peter how it's going. And Peter responds, yeah, it's going all right. At the end of the second week, I also go and see Peter. This time, when I ask him how it's going, he says, yeah, it's going okay, I think. Midway through the third week, we're getting close. Peter, how's it going? Yeah, it'll be all right. I'm sure it'll be fine. And when it gets to the end of the third week, when I'm expecting delivery, Peter, how'd it go? Yes, well, no, I know what the problem is, and I'm sure we'll have it fixed in no time, I think. What was the problem? The problem was that throughout the project, I had no objective way to be sure about how well that piece of work was going. Instead, when I work with Jack, not only do we agree that 3 weeks is the right length of time for doing the work, but I also agree with Jack what he expects to complete at the end of the first week. I also agree what he expects to complete at the end of the second week and halfway through the third week. This way, when I ask Jack how things are going, it's either going to be he has completed that piece of work or he has not. And this gives me a fact. Like your best friends, milestones will always tell you the truth. And milestone tracking is about understanding where you are with respect to the milestone. If Jack has achieved his milestone, then we're both happy and he can carry on. If he hasn't achieved his milestone, I can then ask him, how long till you achieve it? Is it a matter of minutes or hours or days? And from this, I can make choices. I've got a choice to help Jack, to advise Jack, to take the piece of work and give half of it to someone else, or possibly even take all of the work and give it to someone else, or to reschedule other activities around the expected delay. The sooner I find out that there is a potential delay in Jack's work, the more choices I've got. The more choices I've got, the more control I have over my project. So, milestone tracking or milestone monitoring is the process of keeping on top of where your project is with reference to your milestones. Which ones have you completed? Which ones are coming up? Which ones do you expect to complete on time? Which ones do you expect to complete ahead of schedule? And which ones do you expect to complete late? Once you understand what is going on, you can assess the problem points on your project and address the issues that they raise. Your goal, of course, is to bring your project back on schedule. Milestone tracking or milestone monitoring is one of the simplest approaches to controlling your project. But that simplicity, to my mind, makes it one of the very best. Please do give this video a like if you've enjoyed it or learned from it. I'll be making loads more great project management videos for you, so please do subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.